So a little known fact about me is that I enjoy the occasional game of Dungeons and Dragons. I've played in several one-shots and I'm currently involved in a few campaigns, and now you're probably wondering why am I mentioning this? And that's because today I want to talk about my encounter with a rather unorthodox player, a rude, sexist, racist, homophobic player. Now, I won't be using real names for players, but the characters' names can stay because I doubt a fictional character in a pen and paper game can sign a release form. So we didn't do session 0 like some campaigns do, we just jumped into a Discord call an hour beforehand and just had a general chat amongst ourselves, which went from 0 to demonetized in exactly half a second. So we knew we'd get along quite easily. Or so we thought. In our party, we have an elf sorcerer, a warforged ranger, a tiefling rogue, an elf monk wizard thing, and a tiefling cleric. So the story starts off in a small port town where the mayor has sought out a group of individuals to help with an issue. This is where my character Killian, the group's cleric, walks into a tavern and after ordering a drink, is informed by the barmaid of this job and pointing to a table with the monk wizard hybrid thing sitting at it. This was my first introduction to the player in question, Dylan with 2 N's because obviously. He's played by an individual I'm going to call Barry. Dylan's shtick is he's meant to be a loose cannon detective, the kind of guy who was a maverick but damn he does good work. He's also meant to be a cockney. You can't see the air quotes I'm doing, but I'm sure I'll probably put something on the screen for you to look at. This cockney demeanour from what the group had to endure seems to be based on Barry watching reruns of The Sweeney one afternoon on Dave and wanting a piece of that action. So I sit down at the table and I ask Dylan if he has any information regarding the job that we've been set up with, to which the very first words out of his mouth were, and I quote, "The mayor wants us to go and blag up some cunts out in the forest." End quote. Red flag number 1. Red flag number 2 comes shortly after Callista, played by someone I'm going to call Sharona, and Phoenix, played by Derek, also enter the bar. Callista is played by what was the only girl in the group at the time, and Dylan immediately got to work putting on the moves. He bought her a drink, shifted all of his attention onto her, and went full on creep mode. And this extended to outside of the game in our Discord calls as well. Sharona showed a picture of what Callista looked like, and Barry started calling her beautiful, saying she looked like a goddess, saying she was so pretty and looked like an oracle of Delphi and the such. But after a rather swift and brutal shutdown, Barry's attitude shifted and Dylan became a lot more condescending to Callista and just the group at large. We had a small scuffle while out on our mini quest, to which Callista got hit with a surprise round by some wolves. This comes into play later on, as this is something that Dylan latched onto as his primary and sole reason as to why Callista wouldn't be allowed to do anything on her own or without his approval for some reason, saying she couldn't be trusted to do anything if a wolf had her pinned at level 1. Anyway, we kill the wolves and we end up fighting an owlbear and finishing the task at hand. It was a little bit more in depth than that, but I'm too lazy to type any more detail than that. Not long after returning to town, we came under siege by an absolute arseload of kobolds. Dylan had this weird motorbike broomstick thing to ride around on that he called Tina. And once we started fighting back against the kobolds, he offered to have someone jump on Tina with him and flank the kobolds. Callista is a sorcerer and had a few AoE spells that she could use, so offered to join him, to which he immediately shut her down, reminding her of the wolves, and then flew off on his own, stating that she couldn't be trusted to do any damage. And this is where I can say that if he wasn't such a dick in this situation, our group wouldn't have been completely KO'd and we wouldn't have been kidnapped by the kobolds. So to cut a long story short here, we wake up on a boat, in a cell. Callista has had her cloak taken away, revealing some rather bizarre clothing, to which Dylan, with no hesitation, immediately asks if her character is a prostitute. As you can probably tell, he is nothing if not a gentleman and a man of moral tact. We break out and we start a skirmish on the deck of the boat in a hostile takeover scenario. Callista was actually the first on the scene and kicked off our initiative order in this fight, and here's where Dylan's behaviour really started to bother everyone. He stuck by Callista's side like he was glued to her. Every enemy she tried to attack, he would also attack, and then try and cut her off on the way to the next kobold, with the same old excuse of wolves and her being useless. We eventually take over the ship and head back to the mainland to rally to support and head back to the island the ship was originally heading to try and free some other kidnapped villagers. I'm skipping over this for a second as this involves something else I want to talk about in a little while. We get on the boat, we make our way back to the island that the kobolds seem to be using as a base of operations. There's 4 more boats and 2 watchtowers overlooking where we were planning on dropping anchor. After Killian and Callista got bored of sitting around making plans, we disarmed the other boat's weapons and rendered them absolutely useless in terms of sea travel. Callista had a plan to get us on the shore with little fuss, and for some reason, unbeknownst to us, pulls a sodding huge greatsword off her back and proceeds to the dinghy to set ashore and put her plan into motion. Well, she would have if she wasn't immediately cut off and interrupted by Dylan once again, wondering, "Oh, how's a little girl like you gonna swing a greatsword like that without hurting yourself?" Once again, not giving her a chance to act without his permission. And at the end of this session is where Dylan's story effectively ends. We did have another session he was a part of, but he left like 20 minutes into it. After that, we voted to nix him from the group entirely. Going back to the part I skipped over in the town, this revolved around how Barry roleplayed Dylan, which became very apparent very quickly that it was just a shielding device he had put in place to deflect blame for anything tasteless he did or said. He was sent to the mayor to get some town guards or weapons to help us out, but in a situation where it should have been a gimme, ended in an unnecessary persuasion check, as his choice of words were... they were horrible. They were just horrible. There were racist comments, he threw in some sexist comments, and he made a one-off homophobic comment as well. His Cockney words, by the way, the list is only of about 5, and they literally are just the words slag, blag, cunt, tool, and gaff. And that was it. Those were the only words he constantly used that could be considered Cockney. He couldn't go one sentence without using at least one of these words. If his plans or ideas were ever questioned, he would spend 10 to 15 minutes explaining himself to no avail. He would never say who he was talking to and would just expect the party or the DM to know who he was referring to at all points, with the funniest example being him screaming the word RIP for a solid minute, leaving the party in an awkward silence before just casually asking the DM where his owl familiar was. As it turns out, RIP was actually short for Ripley, but he never bothered mentioning this to anyone. From what I remember, Dylan's final line in the game was when he was referring to another player who has joined our group for this session, and while this guy was describing his character, Barry steps in and asks the question, yeah, but does he look like a cunt? After that, and another awkward silence, he just mysteriously left the game. The session after that, Dylan was killed off, I got his hat, and to be honest, the mood of the party shifted for the better. Our DM ended up messaging him the fact that he was going to be kicked from the group, as well as to why. And as much as it may sound like that I hate the game for all of this, the truth is, I really don't. My hope is that he saw the reasoning and has taken on or is taking steps towards refining and bettering his attitude. He seemed like a guy who really knew his shit when it came to tabletop games, especially Warhammer, and I truly hope he found a game where his antics were tolerated more than we could have handled, or at the very least he just toned down his less than favourable traits and is enjoying a game of Dungeons and Dragons just like the rest of us. Because I love this game and I would hate to lose my ability to play it in any capacity, but the way Barry acted in our sessions wasn't something any group should have to deal with. Nevertheless, our group is better off now, we're enjoying our sessions more, there's no awkward downtime, and aside from some heated moments between a few of the characters in the game, we get along generally well, and we are all having a blast. And as much as we had to suffer through with Barry and Dylan, I do wish him all the best, and I hope he is now in a game playing happily with other like-minded individuals, for better or worse. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.